On a cold September night in 1931, when the winds cut across the dark fields of Manchuria, no one knew that a small explosion would ripple across the world and shake the pillars of international diplomacy. The night was still, the sky low, and the railway track near Mukden lay quiet like a sleeping iron serpent. A handful of Japanese soldiers moved silently in the dim light, carrying with them a plan that would alter the course of Asian history. They placed a small explosive charge beside the South Manchurian Railway, so small that it barely damaged the line, so crude that any trained officer could see it was staged, but dramatic enough to echo far beyond the field where it happened. When the blast went off, it lit the sky for just a moment, then died out as if nature itself didn't approve. But that faint explosion became the spark for one of the defining crises of the century. Hours later, Japanese officers declared that the Chinese had sabotaged their railway. Their newspapers printed the accusation instantly, and within minutes, troops stationed nearby swung into action as though the entire operation had been rehearsed many times before. By dawn, Japanese forces marched into Mukden, and by the end of the following day, they controlled more territory than any retaliation operation should have required. It soon became obvious to outside observers that the Mukden incident was never an attack to be responded to, it was an excuse waiting to be used. Japan had long been eyeing Manchuria, a land rich in coal, iron, timber, and fertile fields. After the global Great Depression hit Japan hard, its industries gasped for resources, and its leaders saw Manchuria as both a lifeline and a stepping stone to becoming a true empire. The Kwantung Army, stationed in the region, was already operating with a sense of autonomy that bordered on recklessness. Tokyo's civilian government had lost control of its own military, and the officers on the ground were eager to expand Japan's footprint, even if they had to create their own justification. The explosion near Mukden was carefully timed, small enough to avoid suspicion, but loud enough to create panic. And within weeks, the entire region became engulfed under the shadow of the rising sun flag. People in Manchuria woke to a new reality. Streets that once echoed with the sounds of carts and merchants now rattled with the roar of armored cars. Japanese banners appeared on government buildings. Local Chinese officials were dismissed overnight or reduced to powerless figures, watching quietly as their authority dissolved. Villagers stared helplessly as strange uniforms patrolled their towns and new rules were implemented before they could even understand them. The Japanese army moved with frightening speed, every city that resisted found itself surrounded within hours. Manchuria had fallen so quickly that even Japan's own politicians were stunned at the army's audacity. Meanwhile, the international community tried to make sense of the sudden crisis. China immediately appealed to the League of Nations, hoping that the world's peacekeeping body would step in before Japan sealed its control. Newspapers in Europe described the event with rising alarm but also with confusion. How could a nation stage an attack so obviously and yet present it so confidently as self-defense? Even more puzzling was the speed with which the Japanese took over a region almost the size of Western Europe. Diplomats feared that this could become a blueprint for future aggressors, provoke, invade, and then justify. The League finally sent the Lytton Commission to investigate. When the commission reached Manchuria, it found a region that looked calm on the surface but restless underneath. Japanese forces proudly guided the investigators through newly repaired railways, newly established police stations, and freshly draped Japanese flags. They spoke of peace, order, and modernization, insisting they had rescued Manchuria from Chinese corruption and chaos. But as the investigators moved further into rural areas, they encountered villagers who whispered cautiously, revealing the shock and fear that had settled into their daily lives. They spoke of sudden arrests, of unfamiliar rules, and of the sense that their homeland was being reshaped without their consent. The Lytton report eventually concluded that Japan had acted aggressively and that the Mukden Incident was staged. But Japan brushed the report aside as if it were irrelevant. They declared that the world had misunderstood their intentions, and soon after, Japan walked out of the League of Nations entirely. Diplomats who witnessed the moment described it as one of the darkest days in the League's history, a powerful nation openly rejecting international law, confident that no one would stop it. Back in Manchuria, Japan cemented its control by creating a puppet state called Manchukuo. They placed Puyi, the last emperor of China, on the throne, turning a fallen monarch into a symbolic ruler with no real power. It was a stroke of political genius and deception. To the world, Manchukuo looked like an independent nation rising out of chaos. In reality, every decision came from Japanese officers. Puyi lived in a palace that looked majestic on the outside but essentially functioned as a gilded prison controlled by Japanese advisors. The takeover changed the daily reality for millions. Farmers were forced into new economic systems. Traders had to follow new regulations. Children in schools suddenly studied Japanese language textbooks that rewrote their history and redefined their loyalties. Families that had lived in the region for generations found themselves treated as strangers in their own land. And although some locals cooperated for survival, most simmered silently in anger. The Manchurian Crisis was no longer a regional conflict, it was the beginning of a chain reaction. It exposed the League's weakness, emboldened militaristic governments around the world, and opened the door to years of expansion that would eventually drag Asia into a brutal, all-consuming war. What began as a flicker near a railway track became a firestorm that reshaped global history. And as the world watched helplessly, Manchuria slipped into an uneasy silence, a silence that foreshadowed the wartime thunder still to come. The months after Japan seized Manchuria transformed the region into a tense theater of control and survival, where every street and village became a subtle battleground of authority. The initial euphoria among Japanese commanders at their swift victory quickly gave way to the complex reality of administering a land that was vast, populated, and deeply resistant. Japanese officials moved quickly to consolidate power, installing local collaborators wherever possible, creating bureaucracies designed to monitor daily life, and imposing systems that appeared orderly on the surface but were deeply coercive beneath. The streets of cities like Harbin, Changchun, and Mukden became spaces where the ordinary rhythms of life intersected uncomfortably with the machinery of occupation. To the ordinary Chinese villagers, these changes were bewildering. Orders came daily: curfews, travel restrictions, registration of homes, mandatory reporting of any suspicious activity. Some local merchants tried to navigate the system cautiously, appeasing Japanese officials with bribes or cooperation, while others found themselves slowly squeezed out of trade entirely. Public spaces, once buzzing with vendors and conversation, now hummed with the presence of uniformed patrols and the quiet but constant gaze of informants. Fear and uncertainty spread in subtle ways. A neighbor who had once been friendly might report another for suspicious behavior just to secure a small favor from the occupying authorities. Beyond these visible controls, Japan implemented a propaganda campaign aimed at reshaping perceptions. Posters and newspapers promoted the narrative of Manchukuo as a harmonious, modern state where multiple ethnicities lived in peace under wise leadership. Japanese radios broadcasted messages of prosperity, stability, and cultural unity, but these pronouncements often clashed sharply with local experience. Schools became instruments of ideology, teaching a version of history that presented Japanese intervention as necessary for development, framing China as backward and in need of order. Many children quietly resisted, learning in secret the stories their textbooks deliberately omitted, forming networks of discussion and resistance that grew stronger over time. Industrialization was one of the most visible tools of Japanese control. Factories and mines expanded rapidly, producing resources that were shipped to Japan to feed its industrial machine. On paper, output skyrocketed, and Japanese officials proudly noted the success of their governance. But beneath the statistics, life for Chinese workers was harsh. Long hours, low wages, and minimal safety standards created an environment where labor was a means to an end for the occupying power, not a path to prosperity for local populations. Villages surrounding these industrial hubs found their landscapes transformed, forests cleared, rivers diverted, and farmland appropriated. Resistance often emerged subtly: sabotage of machinery, slowdowns, and secret communication networks, but Japanese authorities rarely suspected the scale of the quiet opposition developing under their noses. Simultaneously, the demographic shifts initiated by Japanese settlement programs added another layer of tension. Settlers were offered fertile lands, protection, and resources, creating a new population that increasingly appeared to dominate economic and social structures. The juxtaposition of privileged settlers and dispossessed locals generated resentment that simmered quietly, occasionally erupting in clashes over markets, land disputes, and cultural tensions. These incidents were always swiftly contained, often brutally, leaving communities fearful and yet increasingly determined to endure, resist, and survive in the shadow of an occupying force. Political resistance was also evolving. Small bands of Chinese organizers moved cautiously, avoiding open confrontation while seeking to disrupt the Japanese administration wherever possible. Their tactics were indirect: information campaigns, subversive printing, sabotage of transportation, and careful observation of military movements. Even minor acts: a signboard removed, a train signal tampered with, carried symbolic weight, reminding the population that control was never complete. The Japanese army, for all its training and firepower, found itself constantly wary, its authority challenged not through open battle but through these persistent, unpredictable forms of opposition. At the international level, the crisis in Manchuria began to ripple outward. While the League of Nations had condemned Japan's aggression, its recommendations were largely ignored, revealing the limitations of global diplomacy. Britain, France, and the United States issued cautious statements, but none were willing to commit the resources or take the risks necessary to reverse Japanese expansion. The world's attention was distracted by Europe's growing instability, the rise of fascist regimes, and economic turmoil. To Japanese leaders, this inaction signaled a tacit tolerance for aggressive expansion, emboldening their ambitions not just in Manchuria but potentially across the wider continent. The social fabric of Manchuria strained under occupation. Families separated, young men conscripted into labor forces, women subjected to new restrictions, and elders watching helplessly as centuries of cultural continuity were disrupted. Despite this, community bonds proved resilient. Local traditions, festivals, and informal schooling persisted quietly in basements, backrooms, and secret gatherings. Music, storytelling, and private rituals became forms of psychological resistance, sustaining hope in a region increasingly defined by surveillance and control. Even as occupation sought to erase local identity, the population found subtle ways to maintain it, revealing the enduring human spirit in the face of imposed power. Meanwhile, Japanese commanders began to realize the difficulties inherent in their expansionist project. Controlling territory was not merely about defeating armies, it required managing societies, economies, and human psychology. They faced logistical challenges, including communication over vast distances, shortages of trained administrators, and the unpredictability of local resistance. Officers who had celebrated initial victories now confronted a new reality: Occupation demanded constant vigilance, adaptability, and a careful balance between repression and reward. Missteps could escalate unrest, undermine local cooperation, and weaken the legitimacy of Manchuria as a political entity. By 1933, Manchuria had become a testing ground for modern imperialism. Japan experimented with governance structures, economic exploitation, social engineering, and propaganda campaigns in ways that would later inform strategies in other regions. The lessons learned in Manchuria were noted in Tokyo and in military academies across the empire: the value of controlled population settlement, the necessity of ideological manipulation, and the unpredictable consequences of local resistance. The region's experience highlighted a fundamental truth of conquest: domination on paper did not equal dominance in reality, and even the most organized military presence faced the complex, stubborn resistance of human communities. As winter approached, the harsh Manchurian climate seemed to mirror the psychological state of its population. People moved cautiously, spoke in measured tones, and observed strangers with suspicion. Japanese officers, meanwhile, maintained a constant visible presence, conducting inspections, patrols, and drills intended to display authority and discourage dissent. Yet beneath the surface, the land remained restless, alive with stories, whispers, and subtle acts of defiance. Manchuria in 1933 was no longer just a stage for political ambition. It had become a landscape of tension, resilience, and emerging conflict. The world might have seen maps, reports, and statistics, but the lived reality, the fear, defiance, and quiet determination of its people revealed the full impact of occupation and the profound human cost behind political conquest. By the middle of the 1930s, the Manchurian crisis had evolved far beyond its initial spark at Mukden, entering a phase where strategic planning, international posturing, and everyday survival intertwined in unpredictable ways. The Japanese military, emboldened by the absence of meaningful international retaliation, began consolidating its power not only through military dominance but also via economic restructuring and cultural assimilation. Railways, factories, and ports became arteries pumping both resources and authority across the region. Yet beneath the engineered efficiency, the lived experience of local communities remained fragmented, tense, and acutely aware of the precarious balance between compliance and survival. The Japanese government, though formally distant, maintained an intense interest in Manchuria's transformation. Tokyo sent advisors, engineers, and bureaucrats to oversee infrastructure projects, manage resource extraction, and coordinate the integration of the puppet state into Japan's broader imperial ambitions. While these officials often viewed their work as modernizing or civilizing, the reality for Manchurian residents was one of coercion disguised as development. Forests were cleared, wetlands drained, and fertile land seized for Japanese settlers, often displacing entire communities in the process. Villagers who had lived for generations in small towns or on family farms now found themselves caught in a web of imposed economic hierarchies and social regulations. Resistance had grown more sophisticated, fueled by both desperation and ingenuity. Small bands of Chinese organizers, often working in secrecy and with careful coordination, disrupted Japanese operations whenever possible. Sabotaging railway tracks, tampering with mining machinery, or secretly spreading counter-propaganda were common tactics. Even minor acts of defiance, an overheard conversation, a deliberately misfiled bureaucratic report, or the subtle concealment of resources became part of an intricate network of resistance that Japanese authorities struggled to detect. The occupation forces, for all their firepower, began to realize that dominance required constant vigilance, intelligence gathering, and a delicate balancing act between oppression and calculated concessions. Daily life under occupation was increasingly complex. Families adapted to curfews, rationing, and mandatory registration, while children navigated schools that taught Japanese language, history, and ideology. These institutions were designed to reshape loyalty from the earliest age, instilling a narrative that presented Japan as a benevolent power bringing order and prosperity. Yet parents and grandparents passed down oral histories and local traditions, creating a duality of identity in the younger generation. In small, hidden ways, resistance persisted, clandestine lessons, shared stories, and cultural practices that refused to disappear despite systemic suppression. The economic landscape of Manchuria reflected a mix of coercion and opportunity. Japanese companies and settlers gained preferential access to markets, land, and labor, creating stark contrasts between communities that prospered under occupation and those forced into poverty. Industrial production skyrocketed in some sectors, particularly mining and heavy manufacturing, while agricultural communities struggled under new quotas and taxes. Labor was tightly controlled, and exploitation was commonplace. Long hours, harsh conditions, and minimal compensation characterized life for workers, yet these hardships were framed as patriotic contribution or civil duty by Japanese propaganda. Villagers, however, quickly learned that survival depended on careful navigation of this imposed hierarchy, cooperation for safety, subtle defiance for dignity. The international response, or lack thereof, continued to shape events. While the League of Nations had condemned Japan's actions, the body's recommendations carried little weight without enforcement mechanisms. European powers, distracted by internal political instability and the rise of fascist regimes, issued cautious statements without committing military or economic support. The United States, constrained by isolationist policy and domestic economic concerns, remained largely aloof. Japan interpreted the silence as tacit permission to expand influence, setting a precedent that would encourage aggressive policies elsewhere in Asia. Diplomats debated, commissions reported, but the realities on the ground moved faster than international deliberations. Cultural shifts in Manchuria were profound. Japanese authorities implemented strict surveillance in urban centers, monitored communications, and systematically promoted cultural assimilation. Festivals, public ceremonies, and even architectural styles were modified to align with imperial aesthetics. At the same time, local traditions survived quietly. Folk songs, religious rituals, and community gatherings continued in private spaces, forming an invisible layer of resilience. The tension between imposed culture and enduring identity created a charged atmosphere where appearances often masked deeper undercurrents of dissent. Within Japan, the Manchurian experience became a model for militaristic ambition. Military academies studied the rapid occupation, infrastructure projects, and social control mechanisms, emphasizing lessons in coordination, psychological influence, and strategic exploitation of international inaction. Politicians debated the limits of expansion, but the army's growing autonomy often ensured that local decisions in Manchuria were executed without direct oversight. Officers learned the importance of combining overt displays of force with subtler measures of social and economic control, creating a blueprint for future operations in China and beyond. By 1935, tensions between Japan and China escalated beyond Manchuria. Small border skirmishes, disputes over trade and transportation, and competing claims to influence became routine. The Chinese central government, weakened by internal divisions and political instability, struggled to respond effectively. Nationalist leaders condemned Japan's actions rhetorically but lacked the resources to mount a meaningful defense. This asymmetry of power underscored a harsh reality: Japan's strategic advantage in organization, military technology, and territorial control allowed it to dictate terms, while China's fragmented political structure constrained effective retaliation. The psychological impact on ordinary people remained profound. Living under constant observation, navigating shifting economic rules, and fearing arbitrary punishment imposed a relentless strain on daily life. Yet this adversity also forged resilience and creativity. Informal networks for sharing information, covert education initiatives, and secret cultural practices proliferated. Residents learned to read subtle signs of authority, anticipate potential threats, and respond strategically to minimize harm while preserving personal dignity. These adaptive behaviors revealed the human capacity for endurance, resourcefulness, and quiet defiance even under oppressive circumstances. By the end of this period, Manchuria had been transformed into a landscape of contrasts. Japanese military and bureaucratic power created the illusion of order, efficiency, and prosperity. Simultaneously, economic exploitation, social surveillance, and political coercion generated underlying tension, fear, and persistent resistance. Villages, towns, and cities were caught between competing forces, the imposition of an empire determined to reshape every facet of life, and the enduring cultural, social, and psychological networks of a population unwilling to surrender entirely. The region stood as both a testament to the ambition of imperial expansion and a cautionary illustration of the limits of control, foreshadowing conflicts that would soon engulf East Asia and the wider world. By 1937, the situation in Manchuria had reached a point of critical tension, where local grievances, Japanese ambitions, and international indifference converged into a fragile and volatile equilibrium. What had begun as a calculated military maneuver in 1931 had evolved into a complex occupation, shaping politics, society, and human experience in ways that few outsiders fully comprehended. The Japanese administration, confident after years of consolidation, began to implement policies aimed at not only solidifying territorial control but also embedding Manchukuo deeply into the broader Japanese imperial framework. For residents, however, the relentless expansion of authority and the subtle pressures of assimilation made everyday life both a test of endurance and an exercise in constant adaptation. The urban centers, where Japanese presence was most visible, became carefully orchestrated showcases of imperial power. Streets were lined with official banners, administrative buildings gleamed with new facades, and public ceremonies displayed precision and discipline. Patrols moved in measured routines, designed not only to maintain order but also to demonstrate the reach of the occupying authority. At the same time, underground networks of resistance grew more strategic, employing techniques refined over years of experience. The sabotage of supply lines, clandestine intelligence gathering, and covert education initiatives formed an intricate web of defiance that challenged the assumption of total control. Even in the heart of Japanese administrative centers, subtle acts of rebellion persisted, invisible to the casual observer but symbolically powerful to those involved. Rural life, meanwhile, continued under an uneasy coexistence of coercion and adaptation. Farmers were compelled to meet production quotas, register lands, and navigate new taxation systems. Yet the rhythms of the countryside planting, harvesting, communal celebrations endured, providing a sense of continuity despite the pressures of occupation. Families developed strategies to protect their livelihoods, from discreetly hiding surplus produce to negotiating labor contributions in ways that minimized exploitation. Children learn the dual realities of imposed schooling and home-based cultural preservation, often growing up fluent in Japanese while retaining knowledge of ancestral customs. This blending of compliance and cultural resilience became a defining feature of life in occupied Manchuria. Economically, Manchuria had become a critical asset for Japan, with its mines, forests, and industrial infrastructure feeding the demands of an empire increasingly geared toward militarization. Labor policies ensured a steady workforce for mines and factories, but conditions were harsh, and workers bore the brunt of extraction and production. Large-scale projects reshaped landscapes, rivers were diverted for hydroelectric power, forests cleared for timber, and rail networks expanded to facilitate the transport of raw materials. These developments, while portrayed as modernizing efforts by Japanese authorities, often deepened local hardships and fueled resentment, even as they underscored the strategic importance of the region to the empire's future ambitions. The political theater surrounding Manchuria also intensified. Japan continued to maintain Puyi, the last emperor of China, as a symbolic figurehead, presenting the puppet state as legitimate and independent. International observers, however, increasingly recognized the gap between appearance and reality. Despite repeated condemnations from the League of Nations, effective measures against Japan remained absent. The world's attention, divided by events in Europe and economic instability, allowed Japan to act with a growing sense of impunity. Within Manchuria, this created a dual reality, a public narrative of order and legitimacy promoted by the authorities, and a private reality of surveillance, coercion, and controlled freedoms experienced by residents. Social and cultural control became a central pillar of Japanese strategy. Schools, media, and public rituals were meticulously managed to instill loyalty, promote Japanese language and customs, and reshape historical consciousness. For many residents, these measures produced a profound sense of alienation, particularly among younger generations caught between competing narratives. Secret gatherings, hidden libraries, and informal cultural instruction allowed traditions to survive in parallel to the imposed structures, highlighting both the resilience of local identity and the limitations of imperial authority. In essence, culture became both a tool for dominance and a site of resistance, with each act of preservation quietly undermining the occupier's claim to absolute control. By this stage, Manchuria's strategic position in the broader Asian context had become apparent. The region served not only as an economic base but also as a military staging ground for future operations. Japanese forces used the territory to train, supply, and project power further into northern China, preparing for conflicts that would soon erupt along the mainland. Border tensions escalated, minor skirmishes multiplied, and the shadow of larger war loomed increasingly over the region. Local populations, acutely aware of their vulnerability, developed coping strategies while observing global powers' inability or unwillingness to intervene effectively. Psychologically, years of occupation had left deep marks. Fear, mistrust, and cautious obedience shaped interpersonal relationships, while acts of defiance and cooperation existed side by side in a delicate balance. Villagers, merchants, and city dwellers navigated complex social codes, learning to recognize when compliance was necessary for survival and when subtle resistance could be exercised safely. The long-term occupation had forged a society skilled in negotiation, subterfuge, and endurance, capable of maintaining essential cultural and social continuity even under external domination. Internationally, the failure of diplomatic mechanisms to curb Japanese expansion sent clear signals to other powers observing the region. Militaristic governments in Europe and Asia interpreted the events as evidence that aggressive territorial moves could succeed with limited consequences. This realization contributed to the destabilization of the global order, as the Manchurian Crisis became both precedent and warning. International law could be ignored, occupation could proceed without meaningful intervention, and local populations would bear the brunt of geopolitical ambitions. Manchuria was no longer just a regional concern, it had become a critical lens through which the limits of collective security and diplomacy were painfully revealed. By 1937, as tensions escalated toward full-scale war in China, the long-term consequences of the Manchurian Crisis were undeniable. Japan's occupation had transformed landscapes, economies, and societies while testing the limits of international response. Communities had adapted, resisted, and survived, even as they endured ongoing pressures from military authority, economic exploitation, and cultural imposition. The events of the preceding 6 years had laid the groundwork for the broader conflicts that would engulf East Asia, highlighting both the ambitions of imperial expansion and the resilience of human societies faced with oppression. In the final analysis, the Manchurian Crisis illustrates the complex interplay between power, strategy, and lived experience. A staged explosion near a railway had escalated into full-scale occupation, economic restructuring, and social control, leaving a profound imprint on the region and the world. For the Japanese Empire, it was a demonstration of military and administrative capability. For the people of Manchuria, it was a trial of survival, adaptation, and resistance. And for the international community, it was a moment of reflection, revealing both the vulnerabilities of diplomatic institutions and the moral challenges posed by unchallenged aggression. The echoes of this period would resonate far beyond Manchuria's borders, influencing policies, conflicts, and the course of global history for decades to come.